So yeah, Ashley and I are excited to chat with you guys, and we know that we are the last ones between you and a cold beverage of your choice, so we will try to make this as engaging as possible. As you might see from the title of our slide, we have a view about surveys, but we are at our core, of course, researchers, and we're at a research conference. You guys are all researchers yourselves, or at least research adjacent, so it only makes sense that before we begin our talk, we actually do a little bit of research on our own. So I want to take a moment, and if you can scan that QR code, there is a live survey we're going to conduct about, let's put ourselves in a hypothetical scenario. Let's say your manager comes to you and say, hey, I want you to run a research project, and I need rich contextual insights. What is your method of choice going to be? Is it going to be a focus group? Is it going to be an interview? Is it going to be a survey? Or is it going to be data science or product analytics? So take a moment and vote, and I will pull up the results on my phone. And also, if you can't read that code, it's 6355-2569. So one more time, 6355-2569. Sorry, that's hard to read. I'll give it 10 more seconds, and I'm going to pull up the live results. All right. So I'm glad we didn't anchor you guys too much on the survey question, given the slide title. But 90% of you said your go-to method for a question like this is going to be an interview. And that's not necessarily wrong, but I'm going to tell you why surveys could also be a really effective technique for answering a question like this and providing really rich, nuanced, contextual insights. Oh, wrong button, sorry. So before we begin and sort of dive into why surveys can be really valuable, let's rewind the clock a little bit and talk about the state of the world in March 2020. So at that point of time, of course, we all lived through this pretty recently. There was a ton of uncertainty about what was happening in the world. We realized this thing called coronavirus wasn't probably going to be a minor blip on the radar, but actually there was this sort of unprecedented global health crisis. The US was shutting down, people were fleeing their vacations, schools were closing, etc. But of course, it wasn't just the WHO calling this a pandemic and things changing on a policy front. The world of work was also changing, and that's true in so many ways and so many different industries. So companies like Twitter were among the first to say, hey, you should work from home. I remember myself, Slack said, we're going to close the office for a long weekend and do a cleansing, and then we'll recircle. And I never went back to the office after that. So I'm sure you all lived your own experience like this. And we were all left wondering, how is work changing? We all were experiencing this. We were thinking about our own jobs and the way that was changing for ourselves and our own teams and companies. But we at Slack were thinking about, of course, Slack the company, but also all of our customers or potential customers. And we knew that there was this real seismic shift in the way that work was happening. And we were looking out into the world and saying, does anybody have any good data on this? Does anybody have any insights on how work is changing that could help us figure this question out? And we weren't really seeing much in that world. So we said, we have this question, we're all really excited about it, let's actually study it. Let's put our research chops into practice and try to figure out, how is work changing? And so, of course, the first step once you have a research question is to figure out, well, how should we design a research project? But we actually took a beat to pause and say, okay, we have some priors on how we might want to design a project like this, but let's first think about, what are the goals that we have? Let's try to hone in on what are the true objectives we have in a project like this. And we wanted to be really clear about, like, what are the things ultimately we want to achieve by diving into this giant question. But of course, we can't do that on our own. Ashley and I and our colleagues, of course, have thoughts on how we should structure a research project and what the goals might be. But if we did that in isolation by ourselves, that would set ourselves up for failure. We wanted to really first have a good conversation with our stakeholders and work to align, not just on the question, because that was pretty clear, we all wanted to study that, but also what were the goals going to be. And so once we could work with our stakeholders and all sort of mutually align on the goals of the project, then we could actually start putting together a true research design. So as the saying goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. So I urge you to think about that in your own research practice. Make sure, before you do anything else, start with aligning with your stakeholders. All right, so what were the goals we actually came up with? So first thing was, we wanted this to be a global project. Slack is, of course, based in the US. I live in the US, so does Ashley. But many of our users don't live in the US. Many of our employees don't live in the US. And many people that don't use Slack today, but we want to hear about, they also don't live in the US. So we wanted this project to be global in nature, first and foremost. Second of all, we wanted to truly understand how remote work is impacting different types of people. We have our own experiences that influences how we're thinking about this, but we also know that we are not representative of our users or prospective users. We want to think about all types of people across all walks of life, whether they're in the US or a different country like Japan, which is a very different approach to combating the coronavirus pandemic. We also want to think about people from different races and ethnicity than us. We want to think about people who have caregiving responsibilities versus those that don't, and so on and so forth. So that was an important criteria to think about as we were designing the survey as well. And then, of course, we wanted to track changes over time. We were starting these conversations in the summer of 2020, and we didn't want to just have a snapshot of that moment in time. That would have been really powerful in some ways, but we want to say, hey, we want to do this today, but then also quarter over quarter over quarter, and make sure we were able to track how things were changing, because we knew that the world was changing so much, but that wasn't going to stop anytime soon, because it was just clear that all of these policies that different governments across the world were putting into place, and all these organizations were approaching the pandemic response in really profound and dynamic ways, and we wanted to track those changes. And we wanted to do that in as close to real time as possible. We wanted to say, hey, this is the state of the world today, but that wasn't the state of the world, 4 or 6 months ago. We wanted to be able to generate insights really, really quickly. Okay, now we had some goals with our stakeholders. We had the question, of course, and we said, okay, how can we do this? Going back to that survey I first asked you guys a few minutes ago. Well, the two most common techniques would be, of course, interviews and surveys. And interviews, at a high level, have their own pros and cons. You're talking to relatively few people, but you're going really, really deep with those folks. You can ask them lots of questions, unpack lots of nuance and context, and so on. And that can be really powerful with the right set of questions, with the right set of goals. On the other hand, with surveys, you're going to ask relatively few questions to lots of people. That has an advantage as well, though, because you can cover a lot of ground, and the broad strokes of a survey can be immense, and that was something that was really appealing to us. And then, of course, the data you're going to get back from a survey is, if you design it that way, can be very structured and quantitative in nature. And that was really important to us because, again, we wanted to move really quickly and get insights in as close to real time as possible. And with quantitative-based survey data, we could structure our analyses to be really scalable and to move really quickly and track them over time again. So the takeaway here is not that we think interviews are a sort of subpar technique. That's the furthest thing from the truth. Just in the specific case of our project, understanding how work was changing over time for lots of different types of people, surveys made the most sense. But to give a little spoiler away for something Ashley's going to talk about later in this talk, we actually ultimately did some interviews to supplement what we learned from a survey-based approach. So survey-based approach doesn't mean survey-only approach in our case. Okay, the second lesson from our project that I want to share with you guys is that design is everything. And surveys can allow you to go really quickly. And again, that was a goal we really wanted to strive for, is speed. So you may have said, hey, if you wanted to optimize for speed, did you figure out, hey, you're going to run a survey, let's just go into the field as quickly as possible, spin up a survey and start getting data, and then a week from now we have a full deck to share with our stakeholders? Actually, no. The first thing we did wasn't spin up a survey. It was to think about what are the questions that we want to answer, and we put together an analysis plan and say, once we get this data back, when that comes, what are the exact slides we want to generate or the charts we want to generate with all of this data? And so we thought really carefully, again, together as a research team, but then also with our stakeholders, what are all of the questions we want to go through and the subcuts and the subcuts of those subcuts that we want to answer. Then once we had that analysis, that pre-analysis plan put together, we could actually come up with a design of the survey questions themselves. And we wanted to make sure, just like when you're cooking a dish, we're getting the right set of ingredients, because if you have the wrong ingredients, it doesn't matter how good of a chef you are. Garbage ingredients, it means garbage food, and a garbage survey design means garbage insights. So we wanted to be really thoughtful on that design approach first. And that way we could set ourselves up for success. And we didn't want to go 6 months from the design of the project and say, hey, we have all this data, but you know what? It's actually really bad, because the only thing that's worse than no data is bad data. All right, so once we figured out we wanted to do a survey, we kind of knew what we wanted to focus on with the analysis because of our pre-analysis plan. We had to figure out who we wanted to talk to. So we started with global knowledge workers. That's a very big survey target population, though, of course. Like we didn't want to just say, hey, let's just run a random sample of 7 billion people from across the world. Don't do that. Of course, we wanted to make sure people were actually working, because we were asking them questions about work. So if you're not working, we're not going to ask you questions that fit your lifestyle. The other thing we want to do is that the second part of the phrase at the top is knowledge workers. So think of this as somebody who works on a computer or works in what most people might call an office job, quote unquote. So we wanted to make sure we had a relatively homogeneous set of employees in terms of people who are doing the same types of work. Whether they're in an industry like healthcare, education, financial services, technology, if you're doing work on a computer, you have at least some things in common with one another. But still, we couldn't just ask a question or a series of questions to people from 200 plus countries speaking countless languages. We had to constrain it even further to actually make this a tractable survey and something that we could scale over time. So we focused on a few key markets for Slack, the company. That way we could actually be global, but also have this be a tractable exercise. So in our case, that meant asking the survey to people in 6 countries. So we have Australia, France, Germany, Japan, the UK, and the US. And the first 5, you'll notice we have 1,000 people in each country. And so you might say, why 1,000 people? And the reason is that, of course, if you're doing country-level cuts, like comparing Australia to the UK, for example, 1,000 is a pretty good response rate for each of those 2 countries, and say you have a pretty good amount of confidence with any sort of conclusions like that. But we also want to think about sub-country cuts. So if you're saying, I want to compare moms in the UK to moms in Australia, well, that's a much smaller sample size. And if you have 100 in those countries, then that means you might have like 25, 40 moms, let's say. That's not very many, and you're not going to have really any statistical power or confidence in those sort of subgroup analyses. So we wanted that big number to feel really good about not just the country-level cuts, but the subcuts as well. And in the US, you'll see it's not 1,000, it's 5,000. So why is that? So the US, of course, has lots of variation that we were really fascinated by. And we started seeing this early on in our data, that people from different race and ethnic groups had very different responses to the way work was changing. And we wanted to really dive into that. So we said, hey, we want to make sure we're not just getting lots of responses in the US, but lots of responses from some of these different racial groups. So we started thinking about what are the most interesting cuts and subcuts of those populations. Well, one of the groups that was popping out was Black women. So we wanted to have, moving forward, at least 150 Black women in each wave of the survey. Very similarly, we wanted to have at least 250 non-white parents, because the people of color responding to our survey that had kids and childcare responsibilities had a very unique set of experiences that they were reporting to us, and we wanted to really understand that, but do so with some confidence. And so we put in these sub-quotas to make sure we're hearing from lots of those folks every single quarter. All right, now we've talked about who we wanted to hear from. Let's talk about what we actually asked those people. Well, we wanted to cover a lot of ground, of course, but you can't ask 100 questions to every single survey participant. That's just not going to happen. People will drop out of your survey. Again, don't do that. That's probably obvious, but I'll say it out loud. But what should we actually ask those folks? Again, this all came back to our pre-analysis plan. We wanted to first, of course, make sure people were employed and working in knowledge work, so we had some screening questions. But more importantly, we thought, is every single question on the survey going to be used by us and our stakeholders in the ultimate product? And if it's not, let's cut it. There's not room in the survey to ask questions that aren't really key to the insights we want to generate. And are there insights we have on our sort of pre-analysis plan that aren't listed in the survey when we were first designing it? If that was the case, we went back to the drawing board and make sure every single question we wanted to cut was provided for somewhere in the survey. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think it's just, again, really important to think about every single factor you want to analyze and make sure you're providing a survey design that sets you up for success. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to talk about what we actually learned from this giant project.
Thank you. Okay, so now comes the fun part, right? I've designed my survey, I have my big questions, and I just get to dive headlong into my data and start to generate insights. And so this is often the point where people kind of feel a sense of paralysis, like I have so many options, what do I do? How do I tackle? How do I prioritize? Wrong. You have a pre-analysis plan. You know exactly what you're going to do first. It's an important enough point that I want to make it twice. So this doesn't need to wait until your data comes back. In fact, it should be one of the first things you do when you're aligning with your stakeholders is say, we know this is our top priority question. When we get our data back, this is going to be the first thing that you're going to see in your deck. So that's what we did. A pre-analysis plan does not have to be fancy. For us, it is a Google Doc with 10 lines of text on it that says, these are our top 10 questions, here are our top 5 subgroups, this is what we're going to do first. What does that look like in practice? A lot of charts. So the takeaway here is not that we make a lot of charts, although we do that. It's just that this is how we've iterated with our stakeholders and determined this is how the data looks compelling to them. We make it pretty, we make bar charts, but importantly, we're just pulling descriptive statistics here. This is nothing fancy. This is things like, what is the average level of this question for this person? We both have backgrounds with some data science, regression. We don't do any of that here. We're just pulling basic facts because if something doesn't jump out to you in a chart and you can't see a trend, I don't believe you if you find it later in a regression. It's probably not real. So a lot of our stakeholders don't have quantitative backgrounds, and so when they see a chart and they go, ooh, that bar is twice as big as the next bar, that's probably a finding you should pay attention to, and maybe we want to talk about it. Or you see a bar chart or a line chart that goes up over time. Why is that? Let's dive into that a little bit more. And so iterating through these things allows trends to jump out. But a trend is not a story, and so just because you make a lot of charts doesn't mean that you end there. And so we have a fantastic comms and content team that take our charts and take our numbers and really craft a story together. So one of the things that we've talked about a couple times here is our interest in Black and Hispanic knowledge workers in the US and how their experience is different. So I want to sort of focus you on this bottom chart here, or I guess table, I don't know, line. And which one of our key findings from this study was that Black and Latino and Asian knowledge workers are actually more interested in location flexibility than white knowledge workers. So this is an example of some of those deep contextual insights that we're able to find doing survey work that maybe we wouldn't have found through interviews. You know, you can only talk to so many people when you do a qualitative interview, and so we're able to, you know, as Lucas said, survey hundreds of people, and this is maybe something that wouldn't have come out from those kinds of research methods. So we've learned, and one of the things that we are fortunate to do is a longitudinal survey, which means that we get to do it again. So if we made a mistake the first time, or we want to change up our design, we can do that. So at the very beginning of COVID, one of the big kind of dynamics was like, what is better for work, in person or remote? And that was a very black and white way of thinking, but it's a way that we kind of internalized. And so in our survey, we asked people, you know, what do you think is better for productivity, remote or in person? Or what do you think is better for sense of belonging, remote or in person? And then we got those results back and we're like, this isn't quite right. Most people are actually working hybrid or some combination of the two. And so we changed how we wrote this, and instead of asking people in that frame, we said, what is your attitude towards work? So, you know, how productive are you feeling? How much sense of belonging do you have? And then we asked people separately, where are you working? And so we can cut those questions by that other factor, but we're not kind of creating this dichotomy. So that's something we changed up. We also iterated on our sample. So we already had some oversamples that we've talked about, but we saw that the more senior people were in organizations, they tended to answer questions differently. So we were like, that's interesting, but we only have 5 because executives don't randomly take surveys. So let's work with our vendor to get a special sample of executives and see if these results are real. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later. Finally, we paid attention to the news, and we really, one of our goals with this project is to want to be in conversation and be thought leaders on this topic. And so, early this year we saw, okay, executives are really talking about like return to the office, and it's 2022 now, so we need to return to the office. And so we're like, okay, I think this is going to be a thing. Let's add some questions on that. And so then, last week when Elon Musk is like, we must return to the office, our comms team is able to message us and say, hey, do we have data on this? And we can say, yeah, we do, because we're kind of constantly changing our survey and adapting it to how the world is changing. So finally, the ultimate form of iteration is just maybe changing up your methodology completely. We didn't do that. This is a survey-based project, and it's going to stay that way. But as Lucas said earlier, that doesn't mean it needs to be a survey-only project. So we talked about the strengths of surveys, and one of the things that we were finding in our data, especially our executive data, is that they were much more interested in individual contributors in returning to the office. And so we saw that in our survey as well, and we wanted to know why, We didn't need to hear from a lot of people. We maybe only needed to talk to 5 or 10 executives to really get a sense of what some of those reasons might be. But we wanted to have an unstructured conversation where maybe we could hear things that we weren't expecting. We're not executives, we don't know, not yet. So here's a screenshot from one of those interviews. And the benefit of these interviews that we decided to put together, because it fit our goals at this point in the project, is we heard things we weren't expecting. When we wrote this survey, we thought, okay, probably it's about productivity, or wanting to make sure they have eyes on people working. But we heard things that surprised us, like my investors are putting a lot of pressure on me to bring people back into the office. We're like, oh, okay, that's actually something we hadn't thought of. And if we had written a closed-ended survey question on that, we wouldn't know. So there's a lot of benefits of interviews. We are not doubting that at all. They just, in this case, are supplementing our core survey project. Then finally, we want to celebrate our cross-functional team. This is not to say, ooh, we have such a big team, you need this. But for the goals of our project, which were to start to build thought leadership in the space of the future of work, we really needed a particular set of stakeholders. So we have a content team that takes our pile of charts and makes them digestible to reporters. We have a comms team that knows how to interact with those reporters and get them to pay attention to us and quote our research in their studies. Another one of our goals is to influence executives at companies and really make them feel comfortable with flexibility in the workplace. So we have a partnerships and a leadership team that are able to build those relationships and conversations. The research is the foundation of that, but we don't and we can't do all of those jobs. So this is the team that supports our goals. Your cross-functional team is going to look really different for your project, but think about the people that you ultimately want to influence and the change you want to make. Ashley and Alex did a great job talking about that in the previous slide. They had a completely different group of stakeholders, but it's really the same principle. And then finally, just to kind of bring things full circle, we started with the kind of scary news of COVID and what does that mean for the future of work? And we're really proud that through this project, we've been able to participate in that conversation. That's one of our stakeholders at Slack being interviewed, which is really exciting. And really the research survey project that we built is the foundation of all of that. So we hope that next time that you want to design a research project and you get the survey question like this, it doesn't have to be the first thing or the only thing you do, but consider survey research as part of your potential stable of options, and remember our lessons along the way. So thank you.